Hi, good afternoon. It's Thinking Slow Group. We've seen a few videos going around about the Great Reset, and this is something we were into very early on, and we'd explained the irrational response and unscientific response to a virus by much wider and more significant political agendas, mainly the Great Reset. So we thought we're trying to just do a quick video which compresses a bunch of the material that we've released as tweets over the last year, and to show you that, why we came to that conclusion. And as time goes on, that conclusion looks more and more credible. I think when we put the initial analysis out more than a year ago, it was maybe a little bit early and hard to believe, but as time goes on, it gets more believable. And the facts start coming out, basically. So the beginning of the journey for us, very briefly, was the initial forecast of 510,000 deaths in an unmitigated pandemic by the famous Professor Ferguson. We knew, even as non-epidemiologists, that wasn't realistic based on actual data. And talking to other epidemiologists who actually do understand this, they confirm that our back of the envelope numbers were more or less correct, that this is just not possible. But yet we carried on with this policy response, and we also understood that whoever appointed Professor Ferguson must have been 99.9% sure that he would come out with an outlandish exaggeration of the number of deaths in an unmitigated pandemic. And of course, that one projection was used then for this insane policy response, and the biggest power grab ever seen in British history, probably. And I think what it's shown is that the system we had was really always, and every system is reliant on integrity and intelligence of the people at the top. And when those people, like now, have no integrity, the system can be hijacked, and that's essentially what's happened. And it's been hijacked just based on a forecast from someone who would be guaranteed to produce an exaggerated and unrealistic forecast. That's all it took to basically turn everything on its head. And then as we got into this process, the policy responses that we had, they're not sort of debatable. They're completely unscientific. So the wearing masks endlessly all the time for all people is completely anti-science. If you look at all of the science pre-March 2020, it says don't do that, and that's what we ended up doing. Exactly the same thing for lockdown. I mean, nobody in his right mind would lock up the whole population, including people that are healthy, and we turned that on its head as well. And also border closures. You look at the pandemic response plan, it doesn't call for border closures, but we essentially closed borders or restricted travel in a way that doesn't make any sense. So none of the things that we did made sense, and they were 100% contrary to established science, but they were all written in this lockstep scenario. So everything we did was actually written in this document. And of course now this document also predicted biometric IDs for everybody, and of course that's where this train is headed at the moment. And like a lot of what we looked at, this was written by a guy called Peter Schwartz, and that name keeps cropping up over and over again. So I'm just giving you the summary of why we made these conclusions. But in a lot of these, and a lot of analysis, it's always the same names and the same people cropping up in different points in time. So, and then pretty shortly after having this sort of completely unscientific policy response, various interest groups pop out of the woodwork and say, well, actually, isn't this great? The most obvious of those interest groups were the climate lobbyists who said this is great and we should keep it. So you start wondering, are they using this pandemic to further their agenda? I think the answer to that was yes. We also see then quite a big group of neo-Marxists popping up, saying, capitalism is finished and we need to basically get rid of it. So they're Also, are they hijacking a policy response that's destroying business and collapsing the economy? I think the answer to that is yes. The quote here I'm not going to go into, but remarkably it's from Oxfam, which is a sort of, in theory, a charity alleviating famine. And it's making some very drastic policy statements about how bad capitalism is and neoliberalism is. And then, of course, for unethical politicians, this is a chance of a lifetime for a power grab. And, as we keep extending over and over again the Coronavirus Act, and as they grab more and more power and ignore more and more civil liberties and start pushing through mandatory vaccination, it's clear that they have grabbed power and they intend to hold on to that power and expand it. So those were the agendas that were basically being furthered by a completely unscientific policy response to COVID. And then, we could get into a lot of conspiracy theory about who is sort of behind, who's pulling the strings. Is anyone pulling the strings? But I think Dominic Cummings, who I find to be slightly unhinged, to be honest, has given us an excellent window into, who is pulling the strings here, because in his very long testimony to Parliament, he refers to Bill Gates 8 times specifically in describing the UK policy response. So, it's a given that, for example, Bill Gates had a very significant influence in the policy response, and we've said that the policy response was completely unscientific, and we'll come back to that question. So at this point, we were starting to make guesses. What is this sort of reset, and what do these people want, basically? And these people, I mean, a sort of global oligarchy that has pretty significant influence over our policy setting. And we came up with these guesses early on that a lot of sectors of the economy are going to be shut down. And I think, I sort of slightly feel for the food and retail, and particularly leisure travel, saying, what's the government going to do? Well, I'm afraid that in many instances, the government wants those sectors shut more or less in line with the Great Reset. I think we guess then that we're going to see people herded into smart cities once they've been gutted of offices and retail operations. And we guessed about remote schooling, and essentially, the big guess is they actually want people on a universal basic income and basically to be sitting at home 100% dependent on the government and having a very limited ability to actually spend that sort of minimal universal basic income. And I think what's been remarkable is the Bank of England coming out recently and saying, well, actually, if this is in cryptocurrency, we can control what that cryptocurrency is spent on. So you're really now being reduced to a sort of modern day serf with a book of rations, sort of a wartime system where you can only purchase certain things up to a certain amount dictated by the government. Pretty scary stuff, to be honest. So then also you have the World Economic Forum and their social engineers coming out with a complete game plan for how you live, basically. So at the top, they had one of these surveys, which I'm pretty sure would be fake, or at least it seems pretty unlikely, where things like freedom of speech was ranked as a completely irrelevant thing. Nobody cares about it. So the implicit message is if you care about freedom of speech or liberty, you're somehow weird. I'm sure this is sort of part of their social engineering setup to make people think it's strange to care about liberty. They also, of course, were pushing early on this digital identity, which is pretty clear now. It's sort of becoming clearer and clearer, that agenda. And even back then, they made it clear that without this, you can't have access really to anything. So, you might not be able to see it there, but the outer circle is financial services, food, travel, and basically everything: school, government, telecommunications, smart cities, and healthcare. So, of course, this is what they didn't add in here is social credit score, which is where this system is heading, where some kind of bureaucrats, we can come into that, where basically the bureaucrats and the business are fused. But basically that body, however you want to call it, can turn you on and off on a whim, basically. No need for any boring details like evidence or cases or judges or anything. It'll just be switched on and off, basically. Another part of their social engineering was the universal basic income we've already mentioned, and they're sort of advertising how good it is here. Well, I mean, it's good for them because it makes you 100% dependent on them, basically. And then even so far as to what you're going to eat. So this was a complete game plan of how people are going to live and think and behave. And then, of course, we wrote our sort of paragraph guess before we actually got hold of this book from Klaus Schwab. And it's all in there, essentially. This is not conspiracy theory. It's all out in the open. They do want structural changes in behavior. That is the Great Reset. The powers that be, let's call them the global oligarchy, they have decided, how much you're going to drive your car, whether you're going to be flying, how you're going to heat your home, what you're going to eat, and they're going to basically make sure that continues irrespective of whether there's COVID or not. It's telling you here the crisis will have gone to waste unless this stuff becomes permanent. And that's what they want. They want structural changes in behavior. That is the reset. It's a top-down sort of blueprint of what these people have decided, and it's just going to be implemented on you and I. That's it. There's no sort of democracy involved in that process. It's completely top-down dictatorship. Then, unfortunately, it's even more worrying than we had in our paper, which was sort of quite severe limitation of your liberty. I mean, even sitting at home on the universal basic income, where you're told what you can and can't buy. It sounds terrible, but actually, what they have in mind in the more distant future is significantly worse even than that. So, this is the MOD paper that we've done a video on, where they're talking about gene therapies will basically be done to you, and the decisions about how and when that's done will be essentially for the government to do, rather than having people, ethicists or public opinion, getting in the way of government decisions on gene therapy. So, they're talking about complete loss of bodily autonomy for you. Completely mind-blowing. I mean, if you don't have bodily autonomy, you've got nothing, essentially. And then this is even now worse than, middle-aged serfs in the Middle Ages. This is zero autonomy, nothing, no respect for the individual whatsoever. And also related to that is this existing patent from Microsoft, which we've done a video on as well. I mean, not conspiracy theory, you can look it up, that's the number there. But essentially the person is plugged into a system, and the system decides whether the person has performed the task allocated to them through sensors, either implanted in the body or wearable sensors. So, again, pretty dystopian, sort of Orwellian existence that they have planned for us. You're just literally part of the machine. And there's a lot of work been done on this Internet of Bodies, IOB, which is also expanding on this theme, but pretty bad stuff, I would say. I mean, of course there's going to be technology, and we need to adapt to technology and adapt with technology, but I think the kind of top-down, you people are basically here in this game plan right at the bottom as little cogs, and we decide, when your genes are going to be altered, and we're going to put these sensors on you so we can check whether you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. It's pretty bad, basically. This is really bad stuff. So, just wrapping up then, at the end of 2020, we did identify these interest groups that are intent on destroying our liberty and neoliberalism. One we've been through is the World Economic Forum, which is basically the global oligarchy. Big health, big pharma now is basically selling 7 billion virus vaccine doses into you on an ongoing basis through the boosters. The neo-Marxists and the radical Greens basically got together as well. Same agenda, there shouldn't be private sector ownership. The economy needs to be tanked. So they're basically operating more or less in sync. Of course, big tech, which you can add into the World Economic Forum, they are basically enjoying a bonanza by destroying small businesses. And last but not least, China. And I think really China is maybe partly to do with the destruction of our economy and the wokeification of military, but probably more importantly is the destruction of our liberal values. So you've actually destroyed a whole competing value system. So we already today are not really in much of a position to go around lecturing Russia, Belarus, China, whoever, about human rights. We've basically been arresting people on marches. We're getting into all sorts of very unhealthy limitations over freedom of speech, and we're locking up journalists. We've got quite a lot of bad stuff on our own plate now, so that's sort of weakening a competing value system. It's no longer in a sort of moral position to go around and square up to authoritarian regimes, because we're heading exactly in that direction, and we're already almost there, to be honest. Certainly for Australia, it's there, I would say, at this stage. So we tried to present this as a bit of a light-hearted walk through the Great Reset, but unfortunately it's got a very serious side to it as well. And this is something few people, there's a few of us, but we talk about it, which is the fact that while all this insanity continues, thousands of people a week are dying at home in England with very large excess deaths from non-COVID reasons. And one of the things we're sort of worried about is the disruption to GP surgeries. I mean, we hear all the stories all the time. It's very difficult to get in. People are not being seen. There's been estimates early on that there'd be hundreds of thousands of additional deaths through cancer and heart disease and diabetes. And it looks like that's a reality. And very, very little is being done about this. And of course, the Great Reset agenda on health is to essentially is not to have those GPs and not to have that person-to-person contact, but it's to open this whole sector up to telemedicine. So this is another one of their agenda items that is being implemented. They're achieving what they essentially wanted, a complete lack of liberty, with taking liberty from the people. They want to further telemedicine. They want basically emissions reduced, and so on and so forth. So, this is another agenda item for them, which is actually terrible for people. And, we got pretty upset about this early on, but at some point you just have to sort of live with it, because the idea of thousands of people a week dying at home and not being properly looked after is pretty upsetting, to be honest. And that is the dark side of this whole process, that they are crushing normal people as they pursue their oligarch aims and objectives. So wrapping up then, this is from another sort of colleague of ours, I guess, who's been in the analysis trench right from the beginning. This is something he did last year. I think a very neat diagram showing that this is not about left versus right. The whole sort of red-blue paradigm is a distraction. I think this is about people who believe in liberty and an authoritarian government that's been captured by this global elite. And, although that sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory, despite the fact that there's so much evidence to show that this is happening, it's worth pointing out that there is a sort of well-established sort of political theory, the iron law of oligarchy, from 1911. So, this is a theory. It's pretty credible. It was developed by someone who's credible. It's just not a bunch of guys sitting at home on Twitter. This is a well-established theory that makes a lot of sense, and I think we're seeing that theory play out in reality. And you see that a lot actually around the world. Governments more or less captured by interest groups, and why not see that here? And I think that's what's really happened. The global Davos oligarchy has basically captured the policy-making process, and that policy-making process is carried out for their benefit, not for our benefit, and they know that, and a lot of us are waking up to it. So because they know that they'll have to take away liberties to push through stuff that's going to be deeply unpopular, and I think that's what's going on. That's why we're seeing authoritarianism. And now is a good time to unite as much as possible and sort of leave the left-right paradigm to the side for a while this process is going on. I think there's a lot, all people have a lot in common versus their political masters at the moment. So what's coming next, just to finish off? I think this winter is going to be bad. I think I'm not going to sort of hold back on punches here, but I think the government is actually engineering a crisis. The forced vaccination of care home workers, they understand perfectly well, will force out somewhere up to 70,000 workers from care homes, and they're going to do the same thing now for the NHS. That'll force out about 140,000 maybe people from there. So they are actually engineering the collapse of healthcare going into autumn 2021. On top of that, we do have these questions on the vaccine with antibody dependent enhancement. So there's questions there. So I think this winter is going to be a bit of a mess, basically. But I think also beyond then, a lot of people are talking about, well, okay, we'll get rid of the Tories at the next election, and then Labour will come in and everything will be fine. As I said before, we see actually both groups as more or less captured by those vested interests in Davos. And I think also what we've seen is the level of dishonesty of these people is sort of limitless, essentially. So it's no longer a given that there's going to be a full, free and fair election at some point down the road. There's every chance that those things will be tinkered with, or so that's more of an assumption now than a given at this stage. I don't think these people are prepared to do more or less anything to do their Build Back Better agenda. So I think you have to be careful about that, and they can cause tremendous amount of damage between now and any next election. But the most positive things probably happening are that there are completely new political movements that are basically understanding the fact that certainly the so-called Conservative Party, which is really just now a vehicle that's been captured by these sort of vested interests. It's no longer the Conservative Party of old. People are realizing that, and new parties are forming up. And here's one we've been looking at, the Alliance for Democracy and Freedom, sort of, again, apolitical in the left-right sense, but very much into liberty and freedom, and that's where we need to be at the moment. I think a lot of us, and this is increasing quite quickly, and it's fortunate, which is a complete collapse in the trust of the mainstream media, and that's borne out by various surveys. That's another plus, that people hopefully will stop reading and believing a lot of what's in the papers, or at least they'll be able to sift through the sort of political broadcast versus what's factual. And if there's something that's factual, it's only a small percentage of what's published overall. And also the realization that a lot of the policy sort of making apparatus through the universities, a lot of those people are massively pro-China. They're neo-Marxists, and they're just pushing a political agenda. And I think basically, the long and the short of what's going on is a lot of political agendas, some of which you can agree with and disagree with. I disagree with almost all of them, have been grafted onto a completely unscientific COVID response in order to achieve the Great Reset. And that's really what's going on. The Great Reset is a blueprint of how you, your family, your friends, how all of us are going to live our lives. Everything from where we go, what we do, how we do it, who we see, what we eat, everything will be regulated by the Davos oligarchy, who have decided to impose the Great Reset on us. And that's really what's going on. So hope you found this interesting. Please subscribe, follow us on Twitter. A lot of what goes out through our Twitter feed becomes news about 8-9 months later. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, then look us up on Twitter. Thank you very much. Goodbye.